Elijah won the most explosive confrontation of his life and collapsed because of the threat of a single woman. And this is where the story stops looking heroic. Israel is drowning in idolatry. Ahab is weak. Jezebel is not. Baal has become the religion of the system. That is the setting. It is not just a nation with a few spiritual problems around the edges. It is a nation where false worship has moved into the center, where leadership is compromised, and where the people have become very good at drifting wherever power seems strongest. Ahab has the throne, but not much firmness. Jezebel does not need the throne to dominate the atmosphere. She already does. Then Carmel happens, and Carmel looks like the turning point. Elijah steps into the kind of public confrontation most people would avoid with impressive enthusiasm. One prophet against hundreds. 2 altars. 2 sacrifices, no human fire. The God who answers with fire is the true God. Simple rules, extremely high stakes. The prophets of Baal go first. They shout, dance, call, and keep going for hours. It is loud, it is dramatic, it is very committed, it is also completely useless. No fire falls, no voice answers, nothing moves. Elijah, to his credit or possibly to everyone else's discomfort, is not especially polite about this. He mocks them. Maybe Baal is busy, maybe he is traveling. Maybe he is asleep. It is not a gentle moment. Elijah is not trying to win most respectful participant. Then Elijah takes his turn. He repairs the altar of the Lord. He prepares the sacrifice. He pours water over everything again and again until the whole setup looks less like a miracle scene and more like a very determined refusal to make things easy. Then he prays, briefly. No spectacle, no panic, no endless performance, and fire falls. It consumes the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the dust, and even the water. The crowd reacts, the false prophets lose. Baal is exposed in the most public way possible, so now everything should get better. It does not. That is the strange part. Carmel feels like the moment that should solve the crisis. Fire from heaven usually seems like the kind of thing that should settle the argument, silence the opposition, and create at least a little national clarity for more than 5 minutes. But public victory does not automatically fix private collapse. It is like winning the biggest public battle of your life and falling apart the next day. And that is exactly where Elijah's story becomes more human than most people expect. Because the miracle happened. The crowd reacted, the false prophets lost, the prophet of fire stood in the center of the biggest spiritual showdown of his life and won. And still, none of that meant he was okay. The fire was real. The victory was real. The pressure was real too, but after the fire comes the part almost no one reads the right way. Elijah's problem was not just Jezebel, it was the feeling that there was no one left. That is where the pressure starts to distort everything. On the outside, Elijah still looks like the man from Carmel, the prophet who stood in public, faced hundreds and did not flinch. The man who knew exactly when to speak, when to pray, and when to let fire make the final argument. In public, he is strong. In silence, he is drained. He is still faithful, but he is already emotionally worn down in ways that are much easier to miss when a crowd is still reacting to the miracle. That is part of the problem. Public strength hides private depletion very well, especially for a while. Ahab, meanwhile, is still king. Technically, he has the throne, the title, and the official role. What he does not seem to have is firmness. He is basically the kind of leader who lets chaos grow because confrontation feels like too much work, which means Jezebel remains the real danger. She does not argue with Elijah. She does not try to out-explain him. She does not enter a theological debate and hope for the best. She hunts Elijah, that matters, because fear changes shape when it stops being abstract and starts sounding personal. Carmel was public. Jezebel's response is direct. It is no longer a national standoff on a mountain with rules, witnesses, and a clear challenge. Now it is personal, immediate, and aimed straight at one exhausted man. And when someone starts believing they are carrying everything alone, any threat grows. That is what starts happening to Elijah. The external danger is real, yes, but the deeper problem is the way pressure begins to reshape perception. He is no longer just facing Jezebel. He is facing the possibility that the whole thing changed to nothing, that the system is still standing, that the queen is still hunting, that the king is still weak, that the people are still unstable, and that he, somehow, is the only one left trying to hold any of this together. That thought is dangerous, because once the mind starts moving in that direction, every threat gets bigger, every silence gets heavier, and every problem starts feeling like proof that you were abandoned in the work. It is like holding a collapsing project together by yourself and starting to believe that you are the only functional person left in the room. At that point, the threat itself is not the only issue anymore. Exhaustion starts helping fear write the interpretation, and Elijah is already vulnerable to that. He is not weak, he is not faithless, he is not suddenly a different person from the one on Carmel. He is the same man, just later, more tired, more exposed, more alone in his own perception than he actually is, which is exactly why the pressure starts bending the story inside his head before it bends anything else around him. And that is exactly where Elijah starts reacting in a way that does not match Carmel. Elijah does not leave that victory ready for the next mission. He runs and then asks to die. That changes the tone of the story completely. This is the part that usually does not make it into the inspiring version. The version people remember is cleaner, stronger, and much easier to quote. Carmel happens, fire falls, the false prophets lose, and the prophet of God stands at the center of a national turning point. Then the story keeps going. Jezebel threatens, Elijah runs. He leaves the servant, he enters the wilderness, he sits under the tree, he asks God to let him die. That is the sequence, and it changes everything, because Elijah is not walking out of victory ready for the next assignment. He is not moving from miracle to confidence, from confrontation to stability, from public triumph to private peace. He is collapsing in real time. That matters because it forces the story to become more human than heroic. Elijah is not doubting that God exists. He is doubting whether he can still continue. That is the crisis. Not atheism, not rebellion, not a sudden change of theology, exhaustion. The pressure of Carmel was public. The threat from Jezebel is personal. The miracle was real, but so is depletion. And once those things meet in the same body, the result is not always strength. Sometimes the result is a man sitting alone under a tree saying he has had enough. It is like someone surviving the biggest collapse of the year and then falling apart afterward in a way they cannot even explain. That is what makes this moment so sharp. The prophet who stood before a nation now cannot even picture the next step. The man who looked unshakable in public now wants the whole thing to stop. He is not asking for a bigger miracle. He is not asking for another showdown. He is asking for an ending. Apparently, calling down fire from heaven does not fix burnout automatically. That line may sound ironic, but it explains the scene better than the polished version usually does. Elijah's collapse is not random. It is what happens when the body, the mind, and the spirit all reach the edge at once. And that is why this part matters so much, because the next thing Elijah says is not just emotional, it is interpretive. It reveals how he is reading the entire situation now, himself, the people, the crisis, and what remains. And then something comes out of his mouth that changes the way the whole story has to be read. When Elijah says, "I alone am left," it does not sound like courage, it sounds like limit. That is what makes the sentence so important. It is sincere. It is understandable. It is emotionally real. And still, there is something wrong with it, because this does not sound like spiritual triumph. It sounds like someone too tired to separate fact from exhaustion. That is the real tension in the line. Elijah is not performing. He is not trying to sound noble. He is not trying to impress anyone with dramatic loneliness. He is speaking from the inside of collapse, and that is exactly why the sentence feels so raw. It comes out of him like a direct translation of what the crisis feels like from the inside. But feeling raw does not automatically make it accurate. That is the strange part. The sentence is honest in emotion, but unstable in perspective. Elijah is saying what the pain feels like, not necessarily what reality is, and those are not always the same thing. It is like saying nobody cares in the middle of a crisis, not as precise analysis, but as the raw translation of pain. That is what is happening here. Elijah has reached the point where exhaustion is starting to sound like clarity. The threat felt personal, the isolation felt total, the pressure felt final, and now the interpretation coming out of his mouth carries all of that weight at once. I alone am left. It sounds absolute, it sounds final, it sounds like the whole story has narrowed down to one exhausted man and one collapsing mission. But the chapter is not over. Because God does not respond with another spectacle. First comes food, then rest, then silence. That matters. It would be easy to imagine Elijah getting another dramatic mountain moment right away. Another fire, another immediate display of force, another public sign powerful enough to crush fear on contact. That is not what happens. Instead, the response begins with ordinary care. Food, sleep, quiet. The kind of response that feels almost too simple if someone is still expecting grand solutions. But Elijah does not need another dramatic scene first. He needs enough restoration to hear correctly again, and that is where the irony sharpens. The prophet who had just watched fire fall from heaven could now barely interpret what was happening inside him. That is not a small detail. That is the center of the crisis. Because the issue is no longer whether God has power. Carmel already answered that. The issue now is whether Elijah can still read reality clearly while exhausted, isolated, and emotionally spent. And right now, he cannot. That is why the sentence matters so much. I alone am left is not just sadness. It is misreading under pressure. It is what happens when depletion takes over the lens. The phrase is real, the pain is real, the conclusion is not. And that is where the story starts turning again. Because God is about to respond in a way that dismantles more than Elijah's fear. Elijah was not looking at the end of faithfulness. He was looking at everything through exhaustion. That is the correction. Up to this point, the story has moved through public victory, immediate threat, private fear, flight, exhaustion, and distorted perception. The fire was real. The danger was real. The fear was real too. But the conclusion Elijah reached in the middle of that crisis was not as clear as it felt. That is what finally gets exposed, because God shows him that there are still thousands who have not bowed to Baal. Thousands. Not one exhausted prophet carrying the last spark of faith alone. Not one final survivor standing at the edge of total collapse while the rest of the nation has disappeared into compromise. Elijah is not looking at the extinction of faithfulness. He is looking at the crisis through the narrow lens of depletion, and that changes the reading of everything. It does not just correct the information, it corrects the lens of the crisis. That is the deeper point. Elijah's perspective felt absolute because exhaustion tends to make everything feel absolute. The fear feels final. The silence feels universal. The threat feels bigger than it is. The loneliness feels total. And once that happens, the mind starts treating emotional intensity as reliable evidence. That is what the correction interrupts. God is not simply handing Elijah a missing statistic. He is dismantling the distorted conclusion that exhaustion has been building inside him. The crisis was real, but it was not total. The threat was real, but he was not abandoned. The pressure was real, but he was not the last. That matters, because it turns the whole story away from a heroic tragedy and back toward a clearer truth. Elijah was never carrying the entire future of faith by himself. He only started thinking he was. That is why the ending lands the way it does. The story is not really saying Elijah failed because he was afraid. It is showing how quickly a faithful man can begin reading reality through depletion when fear, pressure, and isolation all hit at once. Exhaustion has that cruel talent, making a person confuse "I feel alone" with "I was left alone." That is the final turn. Because once that line is crossed, everything starts sounding more final than it really is. The crisis grows, the self shrinks, the mission feels impossible, and even faithfulness can start to sound like abandonment if the person carrying it is too tired to see clearly. Elijah almost collapsed, not because God had abandoned him, but because exhaustion convinced a faithful man that he was the last one left. That is why this story matters beyond Carmel, beyond Jezebel, beyond the wilderness, and even beyond Elijah himself. It is not just a story about fire, fear, and prophetic survival. It is a story about how quickly fatigue can distort perspective, and how necessary it is for that distortion to be corrected before it becomes identity. Which biblical story should be simplified next? Jonah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel?